Good day. I'm making this program between two speeches. The speech that President Putin has delivered to the Russian Federal Assembly, if you like, the equivalent of Russia's State of the Union address, and the speech that President Biden, who's just come back from his trip to Kiev, is due to make in Warsaw. Be a battle of two speeches. We'll see which is the more interesting. I've read Putin's speech in detail, and I'm going to say that I don't expect President Biden's to be in any way or shape or form anything like it. But I'm going to come to that shortly. Firstly, I'm going to touch very briefly today on military matters. I say very briefly because with all the focus on the part of Russian media on what is going on in Moscow with President Putin's State of the Nation address, his address to the Federal Assembly, there's been much less reporting of what's going on the actual battlefields. However, there have been some reports. It seems that the Russian forces are indeed, the Wagner assault forces are indeed pressing hard on Berhovo. This is the next village in the sequence, Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovievka, both now captured by the Russians. It's the next in the sequence of villages that the northern pincer of the Russian forces needs to capture in order to close the ring around Bakhmut. And, well, there's less information from the southern pincer. As I said a couple of days ago, there were reports of a Ukrainian counterattack in this area. More recent reports suggest that it's been repelled. Again, I can't confirm that one way or the other, not being there myself. The Russian Ministry of Defense yesterday formally confirmed the capture of Paraskovievka, and I suspect that the major energy, the principal drive now from the Russians, from the Wagner organization fighters, is to push down further from the north towards Chasov Yar, where the two pincers look as if they're intended to meet. And there is simultaneously underway, apparently, some sort of Russian move towards Vuhledar. There's been some reports that around 5,000 additional troops are being transferred by Russia to fight in Vuhledar. It doesn't look as if, as I've said already, that the battle for Vuhledar is a serious battle to try to capture this important town. It's not just a diversion, as some people have suggested. Certainly the Russians have experienced problems and losses trying to capture Vuhledar, but I think that they're definite about wanting eventually to capture this important town, and no doubt at some point that's what they will do. And in the north, in the northern areas of the battlefronts, in the Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman, Kupiansk area, I now read a report which said that Russian forces are now within 15 kilometers of Kupiansk, and that, of course, brings Kupiansk within artillery range of medium-ranged Russian artillery. And, well, we'll see what the Russians plan to do in Kupiansk and whether the Ukrainians will indeed defend this position at any length. I would say that there's been an interesting discussion of the state of the battlefields from Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who in 1945 magazine, 45 magazine, he begins by making some really rather, curious comments, at least I find them curious, about how the Russian military turned out to be much less strong than he anticipated, how the war has lasted much longer than he anticipated. And he discusses in this article how Russia, the weaknesses of the Russian military were exposed by its retreats from Kharkiv and Kherson region. I find this is rather strange introduction because the second section that he then that of this article appears, in my opinion, to completely contradict it, and does so in a way that I find actually very interesting, because in it, Daniel Davis discusses, and I think discusses absolutely correctly, the nature of Russian tactics in the fighting in this war that's been waged in Ukraine. And he says a few things, and I'm going to go to this article, and I'm going to discuss briefly this particular paragraph or section in which he explains the differences between the way in which the Russians and the Ukrainians are conducting the war. And for me, this is actually the key paragraph in the entire article. He says, since April of last year, Russia's general staff appears to have prioritized fighting for objectives or cities for which they calculate they have a reasonable chance of winning. When the Russians believe the cost of attacking or defending a given site is higher than the potential gain, they have demonstrated a willingness to abandon the battle and reposition forces elsewhere. Putin's forces did that by withdrawing from Kiev, Kharkiv and Kherson in 2022. Ukraine, in contrast, appears to have adopted the concept of defending every inch of its territory, no matter the cost. This tendency was first observed in the city of Mariupol, in which the Ukrainian General Staff refused to withdraw, even when it became clear that holding the city was untenable. Thousands of Ukrainian troops were ultimately killed, wounded, or captured. Similar dynamics played out last summer when Ukrainian troops fought to the last in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and recently in Soledar. In each city, the Ukrainian armed forces refused to withdraw. In each case, they fought valiantly and bravely, but sacrificed enormous numbers of troops killed and wounded, eventually losing the cities as well. A similar dynamic is presently playing out in Bakhmut, as Ukrainian troops continue refusing to withdraw, even as Russian forces get closer and closer to closing off the last remaining road supplying the city. As Ukrainian and Western leaders discuss potential spring offensives for the Ukrainian armed forces, the battlefield performance is in 2022 highlight a little discussed trend that should worry Kiev. Ukrainian forces have been successful in pushing back Russian forces 3 times in the war thus far: the April withdrawal of Putin's army from Kiev and Kharkiv, the September rout, I don't think it was a rout, but anyway, that's the word he uses, of Russians in Kharkiv, and the November withdrawal of Surovikin's troops from Kherson city. In each case, Russia redeployed and established new lines of defense in order to prioritize attacking in other zones. But in those areas where the Russian General Staff chose to stand and fight, Ukraine has not defeated them. Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Soledar, and likely soon Bakhmut. And in fact, as I've already discussed in various places, the Ukrainians have suffered enormous losses through capturing Kharkiv, that part of Kharkiv region, which they recaptured in September, and in Kherson region. And of course, in Kherson region, they have failed to consolidate control of Kherson city, which, as Russian commentators have recently taken to saying, remains under the fire control of the Russian army. In other words, the Russian military, positioned just a kilometer away across the Dnieper River, is able to shell any part of Kherson city at will, preventing the Ukrainians from consolidating there. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, the interesting points that Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis is making. And of course, if you've been listening to what other people have been saying, Colonel Douglas MacGregor, Major Scott Ritter, to give him his military rank, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, and yours truly, you will have heard the same thing. Each one of us at various points has made this very same point. Ukraine shows an extraordinary determination to defend every millimeter of territory, whereas the Russians have fought this war in a far more flexible way. There's been a great deal of commentary recently in the West about how Ukraine must go over to mobile defense, how it must avoid falling into the trap, suppose that the Russians have set for it, of engaging the Russians in a battle of attrition. And we've also had comments from people like Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign minister or foreign representative, that Ukraine must learn to fight in a Western way as opposed to a Soviet way. Well, if you consider the Russian army to be the successor of the Soviet army, which perhaps you do, and perhaps you should do, well, then it seems to me that it is the Russians who have been fighting in a more Western way, if a Western way is mobile operations, than the Ukrainians have done. I don't say that the Russians have engaged in big, sweeping armored offensives, but they've never sought to hold ground, which is undefendable. They've never thrown away the lives of their soldiers in pursuit of that. And when ground is undefendable, or when the cost of defending ground is greater than the gain, the Russians have not hesitated to withdraw and redeploy, even as they advance somewhere else. So I think that's a point worth making, and we see perhaps the best discussion of it in this article by a US military officer who, as I said, is Lieutenant Colonel Davis. As I said, I'm going to disregard the earlier points about the Potemkin military, the Russian military being a Potemkin military, which he speaks of at the start of his article. I'm not quite sure what the purpose of those comments are. As I said, the paragraphs that I've read appear to contradict that hypothesis anyway. Now, there was one other interesting piece of news from the battlefronts, and I don't know whether this is true or not. It comes from a Ukrainian source, but it said that the Ukrainian military is clinging on with great difficulty along the front lines. It's been pushed back hard. It's under immense strain. And it said that there are now 190 battalions, Russian battalions, gathering in Donbass, with the implication being, so far as I could judge, that these 190 battalions are at some point going to be launched against Avdiivka, which is, of course, the main position occupied by the Ukrainian army near Donetsk city. Now, 190 battalions seems an awful lot of battalions. I would work out that's about 80,000 men in total. But then, of course, we have been hearing that the Russians do have hundreds of thousands of troops now on the battlefronts. Notice that the Ukrainians are admitting, in effect, that these 190 battalions have not yet been deployed to battle. And of course, we've had other reports from people like Michael Kaufman, one of the more interesting commentators, though a very pro-Ukrainian one, but he does write in a very interesting way. Anyway, Michael Kaufman says that Russian training has not yet been completed, or these reservists have not yet completed their retraining, which I'm sure is true. So these 190 battalions, if they exist, or if they exist in that number, are presumably still being trained up and prepared for whatever battle is going to come. And, well, we'll see. Now, there is one other interesting piece of news from Avdiivka. I said in my video yesterday that there was some evidence that the Russian Air Force had been in operation over parts of Ukraine where it had not been present before and was flying at higher altitudes, and that this might imply that some kind of air campaign is now in the works. Well, we'll see. But there were also reports yesterday that Russian bomber aircraft were operating over Avdiivka and have dropped high-altitude bombs, 500-kilogram bombs, on a large chemical factory, apparently formerly the biggest chemical factory in Europe, which no longer functions properly as a factory, apparently, but which the Russians claim the Ukrainians have turned into a virtual fortress. So perhaps we are finally seeing the Russian Air Force conducting the kind of operations that many people have talked about, using gravity bombs to destroy Ukrainian fortifications, and that might also be a sign of things to come. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation on the battlefronts. Let's now turn to the big political developments. Now, yesterday, as I said in my program, President Biden made what turns out to have been a very brief trip to Kiev, and he met President Zelensky there, and he was accompanied by Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor. The two leaders were seen together in various poses and positions. There's been much comment about this and about how the various images show these two leaders. Images which, sometimes one can read something from images, but I'm going to skip all of that today. I don't think one should put too much into these particular images in what I suspect was a trip that was arranged in a rather condensed way. I mean, the planning has been underway for months, apparently, but I doubt that we're looking at set-piece events, photographic events, as sometimes sometimes happen, which you can read sometimes certain things from. But anyway, the two leaders came together. There was an announcement of an arms package from President Biden, but it didn't seem to me to contain anything new. $460 million of weapons, but they're all the sort of weapons we've heard about previously. And again, there was vagueness about the exact number. And President Biden did give a press conference. He talked about the various commitments that the United States and the allies had made. And he spoke about the fact that Ukraine has or will receive in total something like 700 tanks, thousands of armored vehicles. Didn't specify what types of armored vehicles, howitzers, 2 million rounds of ammunition, all that sort of thing. And all that is essentially true, but as I said, it didn't represent anything earth-shatteringly new. There was no discussion, or at least no announcements, at least not yet, of fighter jet deliveries, of long-range missile deliveries, or anything of that sort. So it was more, I think, a visit intended to create an appearance of US solidarity with Ukraine. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether it actually did that. It seems to me that the comments that have been coming out from some people on the Republican side in the United States, and it must be stressed, not all Republicans are in unison over Ukraine, but some of the comments suggest to me that Ukraine, the Ukraine war, quite apart from the debate I've been discussing already, the one that's going on between the realists, the people who wrote that Rand Corporation report, for example, the people in the uniformed military in the Pentagon, the people who've been briefing the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives, Mike Rogers, all of those people versus the war hawks, the neocons, Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland. Separately from that debate, it seems to me that there's now the first glimmers of a debate in the United States in which Ukraine, or rather the conflict there and America's role in it, is becoming a part of the political conflict between the Republicans and the Democrats, between various political factions within the United States itself. And I think what Biden has done, he might not have understood this fully, is that by going to Ukraine and appearing in Kiev with Zelensky in the way that he did, but by going to Ukraine, first of all, Biden has, in effect, linked the future of his presidency and of his own personal reputation to the outcome of the war. So rather like Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, he is now trapped in the sense that if the Russians achieve their objectives in this war, if the United States loses or is seen to lose, be very difficult indeed for President Biden to survive with his to come through with his reputation intact. In fact, I would go further, and I would say that if there is a military debacle in Ukraine, military debacle for Ukraine and for the United States this year or next, then I think that President Biden can forget about his re-election in 2024. So that's one aspect of this affair. But as I said, it's also doing something else. It's causing some Republicans now sensing that the ground in the United States is shifting against the war. As I said, there's this battle between the hardliners and the realists underway within the US elite, but also there's now increasing numbers of opinion polls which are now starting to show a slackening of support for Ukraine amongst the general American public. Anyway, some Republicans are now starting to talk about this war pretty much as if it's Joe Biden's war. And perhaps the most interesting voice yesterday was that of Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, popular figure in the Republican Party, widely believed by many people to be an eventual presidential candidate. Some have suggested that he's a rival to Donald Trump. Well, we'll see about that. But anyway, Ron DeSantis, who's been very careful about positioning, how he positions himself on foreign policy up to this moment. Anyway, he's now also come out and criticized President Biden for visiting Ukraine, for being more interested in Ukraine's borders than in those of the US, for providing Ukraine with an American blank check at a time when the United States has so many other problems. And Ron DeSantis also seemed to say that the primary focus of the United States should be its real adversary, which is China. He didn't perhaps go into huge amounts of detail, but he spoke about China as the impression he gave was that China was the major adversary, whilst Russia, according to DeSantis, is only a third-rate military power. So why are we wasting so much time over it? It seems to me that DeSantis is starting to echo some of the commentary made in a much more coherent and structured way by another Republican politician, Senator Josh Hawley, fairly recently, which I discussed in a recent program. It's starting to look to me as if Josh Hawley's views that the United States is overextended, overcommitted, is on a no-win ticket in Ukraine, should be focusing instead on seeing off the challenge from China in the Far East, and should also prioritize its own domestic problems. That these views of Josh Hawley are starting to gain traction within the Republican Party. And the fact that Biden, a Democrat president, seems so intent on giving Ukraine what increasing numbers of people in the United States seem to see as a sort of blank or at least open-ended check, that's crystallizing still further Republican doubts and opposition to the war. Now, I want to make this very clear. People like DeSantis and Hawley do not represent the entirety of the Republican Party. They may represent the views of most Republicans in the country, but in Congress, where the votes are counted, the Republican leadership, people like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, people like that, they remain as committed to supporting Ukraine as President Biden is himself. In fact, the criticism that tends to come from these people is that President Biden is not being strong enough. So this isn't a political breakthrough yet. It doesn't mean that the Republicans are en masse turning against the war. It doesn't mean that support for the war is collapsing in the United States, but it could be a sign of things to come. Of course, if we get to a stage when the foreign policy realists, the people who stand behind that Rand Corporation report, which I discussed earlier in so many programs, where they start to link up with the Republican skeptics, with people like Hawley and DeSantis, then, of course, we are in a completely different political game. At that point, we really are in the sort of stage that the United States found itself in the late 1960s, when the doubts that existed about the Vietnam War amongst some members of the elite in the United States finally spread and embraced much of the political class as well, causing support for the war to collapse in Congress. We're not there yet. We might be heading in that direction, and Biden's trip to Kiev might, in a strange sort of way, act as a kind of catalyst. In the meantime, whilst Biden was in Kiev, Wang Yi, China's former foreign minister, now, as I said, a very senior ranking official in the Chinese Politburo, though not, it should be said, a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo. Anyway, Wang Yi is now off to Moscow, having caused quite a stir at the Munich Security Conference. Apparently, he's meeting with Blinken. Secretary of State Blinken was frankly acrimonious. Blinken was trying to get Wang Yi to apologize for the balloon affair, which seems a bizarre thing to do. He was also, Blinken was also apparently floating this issue of Chinese arms sales to Russia. I have to say, this is a very bizarre thing. The United States sells arms to all sorts of countries. It sells arms to Saudi Arabia, which is, for example, engaged in a conflict in Yemen, where the Saudis intervened in Yemen in ways that many people would say was wrong. I would say was wrong. But the United States feels that it's entitled to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. It, of course, provides lots of arms to Ukraine as well. It's busy supplying arms to many, many countries. But China apparently is not allowed to supply arms to a country that it regards as its closest friend. Now, some of us might find that rather strange coming from the United States. I say that as somebody who's skeptical about the arms trade in general, but I am pointing out that, the United States does one thing and is insisting that China, in this case, must do something completely different. But the issue anyway is a complete red herring, because there is no evidence, and the US has admitted as much, that China is at the moment supplying any arms to Russia. What all of this pressure on Wang Yi has done, however, including pressure from the Europeans as well, Josep Borrell had a similarly acrimonious encounter with I gather it was a fairly acrimonious encounter with Wang Yi. What all that has done is that it's pushed the Chinese to make a whole series of statements about the war, about who they see as responsible for the war, and about the general state of relations between China and Russia. And Wang Yi in particular has gone out of his way, again, in various statements to make it clear that he thinks that the primary obstacle to peace in Ukraine, the country which arguably bears the greatest responsibility for the war, is the United States. And he has also made it clear that it is the United States which, by supplying arms to Ukraine in the way that it is keeping the war going, and which is acting in all kinds of ways to prevent a political settlement. And, well, that's Wang Yi. We'll see what he says when he goes to Moscow. He's apparently going to have a meeting with Putin himself. There's going to be discussions covering large numbers of topics, apparently, not just Ukraine, but of course the topic of Ukraine will be discussed. The Chinese have a long-established positions on Ukraine. They want to see a cessation of hostilities, peace talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians, an end of arms supplies to Ukraine. This is something the Chinese have been saying basically since the conflict began. There is nothing new here. And as for that position paper that has been talked about so much, and the Chinese position paper, the one that Wang Yi is said to be preparing, which some people have interpreted as some sort of a peace proposal. Well, I've actually now gone to the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, and a position paper is indeed being prepared. But from what I can see, it's not only about Ukraine, it is about the development of international relations in general. So, again, it does seem, at least at the moment, as if some of Wang Yi's intentions or words have been twisted and given different meanings from the ones that he intended. But meanwhile, we've had a whole string of strong comments from China about the strength of the Chinese-Russian partnership. And there's been a strong editorial from Global Times, which, as I've said on many occasions, is the English language voice of the Chinese government. And the editorial starts, China-Russia friendship is positive asset to the world. And then directly under that headline, there is a picture of a giant tree, which is China-Russia relations. And there is a frustrated and angry-looking Uncle Sam, looking rather exhausted and dripping sweat. And he's got various tools, broken tools. He's got 2 broken axes, a broken saw, and a broken hammer. He's tried to break this friendship, this China-Russia relations, and he's failed. Anyway, that's the cartoon. And then the editorial goes on to say, Wang Yi, a member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China Central Committee and director of the Office of the Central Commission for Foreign Affairs, will kickstart his visit in Russia. This is also the last stop of Wang's European tour and has received significant international attention. According to Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Wang's visit to Russia has 2 main focuses. First, focusing on the development of China-Russian relations. Second, having an in-depth exchange of views on international and regional hotspot issues of shared concern. In the face of an increasingly fragile and imbalanced international situation, as 2 major powers neighboring each other, the healthy and stable development of bilateral relations is beneficial to world peace. And then the article goes on to say some voices in the West are obviously much more than expressing concern about the developments of these relations. And they are attempting to hijack China-Russia relations through the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They either hype up a China-Russia alliance or try to drive a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, saying their friendship won't last long. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken even baselessly claimed that China is considering providing lethal material support to Russia. The goal of shaping the narrative is to deliberately create an atmosphere that normal interaction between China and Russia is a mistake, and to put pressure on every normal interaction between China and Russia. The US has been wearing thick tinted glasses to view China-Russia friendly ties from the beginning and has become even more aggressive in this regard after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. However, it is neither qualified nor credible. In fact, regardless of whether there is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the United States, from the bottom of its heart, has never wanted to see the development of China-Russia relations. The suspicions, provocation, and sabotage from Washington towards China-Russia ties have never stopped, and now they have reached a peak. So, all that pressure on Wang Yi, all those attempts to get China to distance itself from Russia, they're making the Chinese simply assert more forcefully and more clearly that the Russia-China relationship, the strategic partnership between these 2 countries, is not something that China is prepared to discuss or limit or in some way bargain away. So there we go. And in fact, I was just reading a report only this morning that Russian oil sales to China are now growing, and they've now reached record levels. They're apparently almost exactly the same as Russian oil sales to India, and that the economic relations between the 2 countries, between China and Russia, are burgeoning. So let's go now to Putin's speech. And I have to say, first of all, that it was a long speech. It lasted 1 hour and 45 minutes. It was extremely highly structured. It was one of the most structured speeches that Putin has given, and it's been obviously very carefully prepared. And this was a man, Putin, who is always structured in his speeches, always very careful in what he says, and who speaks always, as I said, with care and in a very methodical and clear-cut way. Now, I haven't yet obtained a complete transcript of this speech. I will need to do that. I will need probably have to come back to discuss this speech in full when I do. I have watched it, and I have to say straight away that for a Russian audience, I think it was a compelling speech. I think not just for a Russian audience, incidentally, but also for an international one. But when I say an international one, I mean for an international one outside the West. Firstly, Putin went into a great deal of detail about the origins of the conflict, about the way in which the conflict was caused by Western meddling in Ukraine, how the West supported an illegal coup, as Putin says, in Ukraine in February 2014, how Donbass was repeatedly attacked by Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, how the Minsk agreement that was then negotiated between Russia, Ukraine, the leaders of the Donbass, and France and Germany, and which was intended to provide the route, the path to peace, how that was intentionally sabotaged by Ukraine, and how the Western powers colluded with that sabotage, behaving in a duplicitous and, as Putin would say, dishonest way in the implementation of this particular agreement. He's very careful to point out that this agreement was endorsed by a resolution of the UN Security Council, making it, therefore, a part of international law. He talks about how the West worked to make Ukraine into a kind of anti-Russia, how it supported Russophobic forces within Ukraine itself, how it built up Ukraine's military and trained it, how it was planning some kind of attack on Donbass, which Russia had to intervene in order to prevent. And Putin has also cited statements made by Ukrainian officials. And here I have to say that he is right about this. There were such statements by those officials, or some Ukrainian officials, that once Donbass was reoccupied by Ukraine, the next target would be Crimea as well. So Putin goes on to say that the Russian intervention was one that Russia had not sought. Russia did not seek a war in Ukraine. It was maneuvered and pushed into war, that this was clearly the intention of the West. He links this with his own view of the history of the conduct of the Habsburg Empire in building up supposedly anti-Russian feeling in Ukraine, Poland as well, interwar Poland as well. He also talks at great length about Western policy in the 1930s. Much of what he says about Western policy in the 1930s with respect to Germany and the Soviet Union and the relationship between those countries would be highly contentious among some people in the West, but it is widely accepted to be true in Russia itself, independently of Putin. He talks also about the fact that there are people in Russia itself who've internalized some of this Western propaganda, as Putin would say, that's been directed against Russia. He says that Russian society needs to be united and vigilant about these people. But he goes out of his way, and this is something which the media in the West is not reporting. He goes out of his way to say that there must be no witch hunt. There must be no witch hunt of people with dissident or views. Ultimately, the way to deal with them is through unity within the critical mass of Russian society, not through some kind of hunt for traitors of the kind that happened in the Soviet Union itself back in the 1930s, and which has happened, of course, at other times in Russian history. And he said much in praise of the Russian army and its conduct of the war in Ukraine. And he also spoke about what he clearly sees as the increasingly irrational behavior of the Western powers, not just in their conduct of international relations, but in terms of their domestic policies, about the way in which they are taking positions on certain social questions, which he finds fundamentally contradictory to reason and sense and established religion, and which it's quite clear that he finds personally repellent and even offensive. He does, again, however, say that if the West wants to adopt these kind of social practices, that's a matter for the West. Russia is different. Russia will resist having these practices imposed upon it by the West. But if the West wants to go down this route, well, that's a matter for them. So I would, again, make that observation because it is an important one and one that I notice, again, Western commentators prefer to ignore. He said very little about the future conduct of the military operation in Ukraine. Now, in the run-up to this speech, there were lots and lots of reports, claims, speculations that he was going to make some enormous, big, dramatic announcements about the military operation, that he would order mobilization, that he would declare war, that he would announce some offensive. Putin did none of those things, and in my experience, he never uses these big set-piece speeches for that sort of announcement. When he has an announcement like that to make, he usually does this in the form of a television address, and that's on the particular topic in question. He doesn't use a State of the Nation address in that sort of way. But he did say one thing about the operation in Ukraine, the military operation in Ukraine, apart from saying that the Russians would conduct it in a methodical and steady way until their objectives are achieved. He also said that if the Western powers do deliver long-range weapons to Ukraine, then the Russians will advance further west to make sure that those long-range weapons cannot reach Russian territory. Now that, if we take a step back and think about it, implies two things. Firstly, an expansion of the area of the military operation that the Russians are conducting in Ukraine beyond the southeastern regions of Ukraine where the fighting has mainly been conducted, but also it does suggest some form of demilitarized zone, and apparently a very big one perhaps covering hundreds of kilometers in order to keep these missiles or long-range systems away from Russian territory. That's the one thing that he did say, and I think Western advocates of supplying long-range missiles might want to take that into account. He did talk a lot about the economy and about the state of the economy. And here he had good news to give. Firstly, the latest figures from Rosstat, Russia's statistics agency, which, by the way, it's now generally accepted around the world that its statistics are reliable. The overall figure from Rosstat for Russia last year, for Russia's GDP last year, is that the GDP contraction was 2.1%. Now, that is a lot less than had seemed to be the case even as late as the early autumn. Right at the start of the sanctions war, there was talk that the GDP contraction would be between 10% or 20%, or some people put it higher still at 25%. Then by early autumn, the Russian authorities were saying that it would be around 3%. It's come out at around 2%. Now, that is a smaller contraction than Russia experienced during the previous round of sanctions back in 2015. In 2015, Russia also experienced a recession following the imposition of Western sanctions, but that recession turned out to be of 2.2%, and this recession is of 2.1%. And Putin spoke about a rising pace of economic activity, and he also claimed that in the second quarter of 2023, inflation was likely to be close to the central bank's 4% target. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to say that in the first quarter of 2023, we are likely to see a further year-on-year contraction of Russian GDP. And the reason for that is that in the first 3 months of 2022, the Russian economy was actually expanding quite strongly. So the first 3 months of 2023, as compared with the first 3 months of 2022, will show almost certainly a GDP decline. The central bank apparently is guesstimating that it will be around 2.4%. Well, we shall see. And probably inflation over the year as a whole will be higher than the 4% that Putin says it will be around in the second quarter. But overall, he seems fairly confident. And by the way, on that topic, I've seen a long article in the Financial Times which discusses the state of Russia, its ability to sustain the war. It talks about Russian finances, which has been a hot topic recently. It also seems to think that Russia will experience a bigger budget deficit this year. There might be fewer oil receipts. That's not to be certain, by the way. China is buying more oil at the moment. It may be that over time, over the year as a whole, oil receipts will grow, but let's put that aside. Anyway, overall, it said that no one expects, however, if Russia runs a deficit, that its overall debt to GDP ratio will rise above 18% from the 16% that it is now. And that, I think, tells you all you need to know. The Russians are perfectly capable of covering whatever deficit arises this year. The deficit is under control, as is inflation, and all the indications are that industrial production and agricultural production are rising. Putin also spoke about military spending. He said that there will have to be an increase in military spending, but he was, again, very careful to say that Russia mustn't fall into the same trap that the Soviet Union did in its final years, which is spend so much on the military that there was insufficient funding for other things. And Putin spoke about more road construction, more infrastructure work, things of that kind. And he also spoke about the importance of developing the economy and of building up its industries and its internal manufacturing base. He said that in previous years, earlier this century, some people in Russia had thought of the country as essentially a commodities producer and supplier to the West. That clearly has turned out to have been wrong. Already before the conflict began, over some period of time, Russia had been spending more time developing its industrial base, and this has paid dividends, but there's still a great deal to do. And lastly, on these domestic things, he talked about Russian businessmen, people who had decided to invest their money outside Russia, who bought houses and apartments in Kensington, in London, and those sort of things, football teams and all that. And he said that the myth that money placed in the West is secure has now been exposed. People who did that have lost their money in many cases. It makes much more sense for them to reinvest their money at home. So, fairly structured speech setting out all of these things. And then at the very end of the speech, the tail end, came the bombshell announcement, and it was not directly connected to the conflict in Ukraine. Putin announced that Russia is suspending its adherence to the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Treaty that regulates strategic weapons, the possession of strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, between the United States and Russia. He said that it's become impossible for Russia to continue to adhere to the START Treaty as before. The United States is in effect obstructing Russian inspectors. In theory, they are supposed to be able to carry out inspections, but in practice, the US is making it impossible for those inspectors even to reach the United States, let alone do their work there. So he says that given that the United States is not adhering to the START Treaty any longer, it makes no sense for Russia to do so either. That is an extremely disturbing and worrying event, though given the crisis in international relations, I'm afraid it is an unavoidable one. The whole structure of arms control, laboriously constructed between the United States and the Soviet Union, going all the way back to the early 1960s with the original Test Ban Treaty of 1963, that entire structure of arms control has now, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. The Russians are going to continue to build up their strategic forces. Putin spoke about their willingness to resume nuclear testing if the United States does so. And of course, the Chinese are forging ahead, building up their strategic nuclear forces as well. Another country, North Korea, now has intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, and apparently is planning to build ballistic missile nuclear-powered submarines. And I'd recently read a report which said that Iran has now enriched uranium up to a level just below 90%, which is the level that would be needed to develop a nuclear bomb. There was a caveat to that last report. It seems that it may have been accidental. It's not yet proof that Iran is indeed planning to develop a nuclear bomb, but clearly They have the enrichment facilities and the technology to do it. It's quite incredible to see how the whole structure of arms control has collapsed. And it has to be said, again, that the lead in this has been taken by the United States. The United States pulled out of two of the core treaties of the détente era and of the perestroika era, two of the core nuclear weapons treaties, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was scrapped by the George W. Bush administration in the early 2000s, and of course the Trump administration in its last days scrapped the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which restricted the deployment by each side, by the Soviets and the US, and subsequently by the Russians and the US, of medium-range nuclear missiles. And the US has also pulled out of the Open Skies Agreement. It's made that almost inoperable. And we've now essentially seen that the START Treaty has gone the way of all the rest. And I've got to say this is something that astonishes me, how little people are concerned about this. Back in the Cold War, during the Cold War, I remember that worries about nuclear weapons, the bomb as it was called, were the paramount concern of tens of millions of people. Now, decades of neocon rhetoric and agitation and domination of the US government have led us to a point where hardly anybody seems to care any longer, that we seem to be on the brink of an unconstrained nuclear arms race, and nobody seems to notice that whereas before the United States had only one nuclear challenger, the Soviet Union and then Russia, today it's at risk of having multiple ones. China, Russia, North Korea, who's to know, perhaps someday Iran as well. And the United States, supposedly, presumably, is going to be pushed into a position of competing against all of them. I have to say, when I heard Putin say that, I was neither surprised nor, I have to say, particularly critical. But I was dismayed. My heart sank. I think that the world gets more dangerous with every single passing day. And this is the disastrous blind alley which the neocons and their fellow travelers have led us into. Well, on that dark note, I'm going to finish this program. Next program will no doubt cover President Biden's speech in Warsaw, which I predict will get much more attention in the Western media than President Putin's speech in Moscow. Though, as I said, I expect the two speeches to be completely different from each other. But anyway, tomorrow, as I said, I will discuss Biden's speech and I will update you on any further military developments. It only remains for me to say that if you want to follow our work, you can find us on multiple platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.